Billionaire catches homeless boy dancing with his paralyzed daughter. A barefoot, hungry boy slipped through the gates of a sprawling estate and saw the billionaire's daughter sitting in silence, her face clouded with sadness. Then he did something no one expected. He began to dance, not for money, not for food, but simply to make her smile. What happened next would change all of their lives forever. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 500 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe to my channel, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. George Weeks was one of the wealthiest men in America. His empire spanned oil refineries, luxury real estate developments, and international shipping, earning him the nickname the Iron Hand because every deal he touched turned to gold. Yet behind the imposing gates of his Los Angeles estate, his greatest struggle was not business. It was the silence of a daughter whose laughter he longed to hear again. His only daughter, Lila, once a bright, lively 8-year-old, had been left paralyzed after the tragic car accident that also claimed the life of his beloved wife, Sarah. Once her laughter rang through the house like music. Once she ran through the gardens, chasing butterflies and calling out to her mother. But now she sat quietly in her wheelchair, staring out the window, her spirit dimmed. At first, George tried to fight it with his wealth. He flew her to the Mayo Clinic for surgery, to Switzerland for experimental therapy, to Johns Hopkins for advanced treatment. Every attempt ended in the same crushing disappointment. Lila's smile faded, her laughter disappeared. She rarely left her room, except when her nanny rolled her into the garden. George, though powerful and commanding in the boardroom, felt his heart breaking each day. He saw her staring blankly into the distance, unreachable despite all his money and influence. The boardroom fell silent the moment George Weeks raised his hand. 15 executives, each commanding 7-figure salaries, leaned forward as he spoke, his voice measured and absolute. The Singapore deal closes by Friday, or we move to Jakarta. I don't negotiate with hesitation. His signature on the contract was worth $12 million. Outside the glass tower, Los Angeles sprawled beneath him, oil refineries pumping his profits, luxury high-rises bearing his name, shipping vessels crossing oceans under his flag. They called him the Iron Hand because everything he touched turned to gold, and everyone who opposed him learned to bend. But the silence that greeted George when he pushed open the doors of his Bel Air mansion was different. It was the kind of silence that suffocated. His footsteps echoed against marble floors as he walked through rooms filled with priceless art that no one looked at anymore. The grand piano in the corner hadn't been played since Sarah died. He paused, his hand resting on the polished wood, and the memory hit him like it always did. Sudden, violent, unavoidable. The screech of tires on Pacific Coast Highway, Sarah's scream, the sickening crunch of metal. Then silence. The kind that meant everything had changed forever. Lila had been in the back seat. She survived, if you could call it that. George found her in the sunroom, exactly where she'd been that morning. His 8-year-old daughter sat motionless in her wheelchair, staring through the window at a world she no longer seemed to belong to. Her lunch tray sat untouched beside her. 3 bites of rice, nothing more. "Lila, sweetheart," he said softly. She didn't turn, didn't blink, just stared at the garden beyond the glass with those hollow eyes that broke him every single day. He'd tried everything. The specialist in Mumbai who promised revolutionary nerve regeneration therapy, the German facility with experimental stem cell treatments, the American clinic where doctors spoke in careful clinical tones about managing expectations. Each trip ended the same way, with Lila smaller in her chair, quieter, more distant, with George writing another check that solved nothing. Now the mansion felt like a mausoleum. 30 rooms, each one a testament to his success and his failure. His wife was gone. His daughter was disappearing before his eyes, retreating somewhere he couldn't follow, no matter how much money he threw at the problem. George stood at the window of his study, watching Lila through the glass. Her head rested against the side of her wheelchair, her small hand limp in her lap. The nanny had given up trying to engage her hours ago. In the boardroom, George commanded empires. Here, he was powerless. "I can buy anything," he whispered to the empty room, his reflection staring back at him in the darkening glass. Anything except what I need most. The silence answered him with nothing at all. Melvin woke to the rumble of traffic overhead, his body stiff from another night on concrete. The underside of the freeway overpass offered shelter from rain, but nothing against the cold that seeped into his bones. He sat up slowly, rolling his shoulders, feeling each vertebra protest. 11 years old, and his back already ached like an old man's. The morning sun cut sharp angles through the bridge supports as he emerged, barefoot, his shorts hanging loose on a frame that had forgotten what 3 meals a day felt like. Downtown Los Angeles was waking up, food trucks setting up for breakfast, the smell of bacon and eggs making his stomach clench with want. He knew better than to beg here. The woman with the taco cart had chased him off twice already, threatening to call the cops. By midday, Melvin had positioned himself at the intersection near the 405, where traffic crawled through lunch hour. This was his stage. When the light turned red and cars idled in the heat, he moved into the crosswalk and began to dance. Not the smooth, practiced moves of a professional, but something entirely his own, spinning, jumping, arms windmilling in exaggerated circles that made children in back seats point and laugh. A driver tossed him $1, another $5. By the time the light changed, he'd earned enough for 1 meal at the corner store. When your stomach is empty, if you sit still, the hunger wins, he whispered to himself, pocketing the bills. But if you move, if you dance, you feel alive, even if just for a moment. He found little Maria under the bus shelter on Wilshire, a girl maybe 7 years old, her eyes tracking every passerby with desperate hope. Melvin knew that look. He'd worn it himself until he learned that hope alone didn't fill your belly. He pressed $3 into her palm. For food, he said. She stared at him like he'd given her a fortune. As afternoon bled into evening, Melvin wandered past the neighborhoods where the wealthy lived. Through iron gates and manicured hedges, he glimpsed another world. Sprawling lawns, children on bicycles, private security watching everything. The contrast wasn't lost on him. On this side of the wall, hunger, concrete beds, invisible children. On that side, abundance so complete they probably didn't even notice it. He had fragments of memory, pieces of a before, a woman's voice singing, hands that once held him, but the images were blurred now, worn down like old photographs left too long in the sun. His father? Melvin didn't even know if he'd ever had one. The streets of LA had been his home since he was 5, long enough that he couldn't remember anything else clearly. As darkness fell, Melvin found his way to an empty lot behind a shuttered warehouse in East LA. No audience, no coins to earn, no reason to dance except that it was who he was. He moved through the shadows, body flowing, spinning, jumping for no one but himself. This was when he felt most free, when the performance wasn't about survival, but about refusing to let the world kill what lived inside him. "Nobody sees homeless kids," he said to the empty air, his voice quiet but steady. "But when I dance, for a few seconds, I'm visible." And so, he danced on, alone but unbroken, until exhaustion finally pulled him back toward the overpass and another night on concrete. Melvin had wandered this route before, drawn by curiosity to the places where wealth built its walls. The Weeks estate in Bel Air rose behind iron gates and perfectly trimmed hedges, a world so separate from his own it might as well have been on another planet. He'd never thought to go inside. What would be the point? But today, something made him pause. A gap in the hedge near the corner post, just wide enough to peer through. He pressed his face close and saw her immediately. A girl, maybe his age, sitting alone in a wheelchair in the center of a vast garden. Her head rested against the chair's side, her small body curved inward like she was trying to disappear. But it was her face that stopped Melvin cold, that expression of profound, bottomless sadness. "I know that face," he whispered. "I've seen it in mirrors." The girl stared at nothing, lost somewhere far away from the sunshine and flowers surrounding her. Something moved in Melvin's chest, not pity but recognition. He knew what it felt like to be alone in a crowd, invisible even when people looked right at you. He knew what it meant when sadness became so heavy, you forgot how to fight it. "Maybe I can help," he said to himself. "Maybe one smile." The decision came without thought. He slipped through the hedge, ignoring the obvious risk, and moved into the garden until he stood directly in her line of sight. For a moment, he just waited. Then, without music or reason or any promise of reward, Melvin began to dance. He started with the big moves, arms windmilling like a broken helicopter, legs kicking out at impossible angles, his whole body committed to pure ridiculousness. The girl's eyes shifted slightly. She'd noticed him. Melvin spun 3 times, stumbled dramatically, caught himself with exaggerated surprise, eyes wide as saucers. He made his face absurdly serious, then crossed his eyes. He pretended to walk against an invisible wind, body tilted at a sharp angle, feet sliding. Lila blinked, her attention fully caught now. Encouraged, Melvin threw himself into it completely. He rolled across the grass, popped up, did a terrible moonwalk, then pretended to be a robot with rusty joints. He made a face like he'd smelled something terrible, pinched his nose, waved his hand. He hopped on one foot, lost his balance, windmilled his arms wildly. And then it happened. A small sound escaped Lila's lips. A giggle. Tiny, tentative, but real. Melvin's heart soared. He danced harder, wilder. He became a chicken, flapping and pecking. He became a tree in a hurricane, bending and swaying. He spun until he was dizzy, then pretended the world was spinning instead of him, staggering in circles. Lila laughed, not a polite sound, but genuine, unrestrained laughter that started in her belly and burst out like it had been trapped too long. It echoed across the compound, loud and bright and alive. Inside the mansion, George Weeks froze mid-step, a document falling from his hand. That sound. He knew that sound. It was his daughter's laughter, something he thought he'd never hear again. He ran to the balcony and stopped, disbelieving. A ragged street boy was dancing in his garden, and Lila, his withdrawn, silent Lila, was clapping her hands, her face alight with joy. Laughter pouring from her like water from a broken dam. George's first instinct was fury. Who was this boy? How did he get in? But as he watched, frozen between anger and wonder, he saw something impossible. This homeless child, performing in his bare feet with complete abandon, was doing what the best doctors in 3 countries couldn't. He was bringing his daughter back to life. Melvin, unaware of the audience above, fed off Lila's laughter, each giggle and clap giving him new energy. He bowed deeply, then somersaulted, then struck a superhero pose. Lila's laughter grew louder, her whole body shaking with it. And in that crystallized moment, George understood. This ragged boy with nothing had just given him everything. George's hand moved toward his phone, muscle memory ready to call security. A breach. An intruder. A street child in his private garden. Every instinct screamed to end this immediately. But he didn't make the call. Instead, he stepped back from the balcony edge, positioning himself behind a marble column where he could watch unseen. The boy spun again, this time pretending to chase his own shadow, and Lila clapped, actually clapped. Her hands, those hands that had hung limp for months, were moving with strength and coordination, coming together in rhythm. George leaned forward, hardly breathing. Lila's posture had changed. Her spine, usually curved in defeat, was straight. Her shoulders were back, and her face, God, her face, had color in it. Real color, not the pale ghost-like pallor that had haunted him for months. Her eyes were alive, tracking the boy's movements, anticipating his next ridiculous gesture. "In 10 minutes," George whispered, gripping the column. "This street child has brought her back to life." Melvin struck a final pose, arms spread wide, one leg extended, wobbling deliberately before falling to the grass in an exaggerated collapse. He popped up immediately and bowed low, the kind of theatrical bow that belonged on a stage. Lila applauded enthusiastically, her laughter still bubbling up between breaths. George stepped out from the balcony doors and descended the garden stairs. Melvin's head snapped up, his body going rigid. Those eyes, quick, calculating, measured the distance to the hedge. Flight response? "Daddy, please!" Lila's voice cut through the tension, louder and more forceful than George had heard in months. "Please don't send him away." George raised a hand, stopping several feet from the boy. Up close, the details were impossible to ignore. The shirt torn at the shoulder, held together by hope more than thread. Shorts several sizes too large, cinched with a frayed piece of rope. Bare feet covered in dust and small cuts. The hollows in his cheeks that spoke of regular hunger. But his eyes, those eyes were steady, meeting George's gaze without arrogance or cowering. "What's your name?" George asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Melvin, sir." "Why did you come into my garden, Melvin?" The boy swallowed but didn't look away. "I saw her through the hedge. She looked sad. I thought maybe dancing might help. I didn't come to take anything, sir, just to give something small." George studied him. This child who'd somehow slipped past his security, past his walls, past everything money could buy to protect his world. "Where do you live?" "Anywhere, sir." Melvin's voice remained steady despite the obvious fear. "Under the 405 mostly. Sometimes in empty buildings downtown, wherever there's space." "Daddy, he made me laugh." Lila's voice cracked with emotion. "I haven't laughed in so long. Please let him stay. Please." George looked at his daughter, really looked at her. She was leaning forward in her wheelchair, both hands gripping the armrests, her whole body engaged in a way he hadn't seen since before the accident. She was fighting for something she wanted, fighting, engaging, living. Pride warred with love in his chest. What would people think? A homeless boy in his garden? What would his business associates say? His security team? The neighbors in Bel Air? But then Lila's voice came again, small and desperate. "Please, Daddy." George took a breath. "You can stay, today, in the open where I can see you, tomorrow." He paused, the word catching in his throat. "Tomorrow, we'll see." Melvin's shoulders sagged with relief. "Thank you, sir." Lila clapped again, this time in pure joy, and called out, "Do the spinning one again." Hours later, George stood at his study window, watching Melvin perform while his daughter laughed. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, and he barely recognized the man looking back, someone whose certainty was cracking like ice in spring. "What is happening here?" he whispered to the empty room. The laughter from the garden was his only answer. Melvin approached the estate the next afternoon, with his heart hammering against his ribs. Maybe yesterday had been a fluke. Maybe the man with the hard eyes had changed his mind. Maybe the security guards had been told to chase him off. But when he slipped through the hedge, Lila was already there, positioned near the garden entrance, her wheelchair angled toward where he would appear. Her face lit up the moment she saw him. "You came back," she said, her voice carrying an excitement he hadn't heard the day before. Relief flooded through him. "I said I would." By the end of the first week, a rhythm had established itself. Melvin arrived at 4 o'clock, performed until 6, and before leaving, the kitchen staff brought him a plate of food. Real food, not scraps from dumpsters. He ate every meal like it might be his last, because in his experience, it very well could be. The changes in Lila came gradually, each one small but unmistakable. Her clapping grew stronger, more rhythmic. By the second week, she wasn't just laughing, she was calling out instructions. "Do the robot walk again. Make that funny face. Spin faster." Her voice, tentative at first, grew confident with each passing day. George watched it all from various vantage points throughout the mansion. He noticed things. How Melvin never asked for anything before he performed. No negotiation, no conditions. How the boy always paused between routines to check Lila's face, adjusting his performance based on her reactions. When the kitchen staff brought food, Melvin thanked them quietly, ate what was given, and never asked for more, even though George could see the hunger in his eyes. By the third week, something shifted. Lila's toes wiggled during one of Melvin's particularly energetic dances. Her fingers flexed and extended when she tried to mimic his hand movements. Her shoulders rolled back when she laughed hard, her whole upper body engaged. "Daddy, did you see how high Melvin jumped today?" she asked over dinner, actually eating her food without prompting. "It was like he was flying." The next evening, "Can Melvin teach me that hand movement, the wavy one?" Then, barely able to contain herself, "Daddy, I felt something in my leg, like a tingle. It was real. I know it was real." Her laughter, once a miracle, became regular, expected, normal. The sound that had been absent from the mansion for months now filled it daily. and George found himself timing his work to be near a window at 4 o'clock, just to hear it begin. Dr. Martinez arrived from Cedars-Sinai for Lila's routine checkup and spent 20 minutes examining her, his eyebrows rising progressively higher. Her muscle tone has improved. Her engagement is remarkable, mentally, emotionally, even neurologically. He set down his stethoscope and looked at George directly. This kind of emotional stimulation can activate healing pathways we can't fully explain. The mind-body connection in pediatric trauma cases is profound. Whatever you're doing, Mr. Weeks, continue it. That night, George stood alone in his study, a glass of whiskey untouched on his desk. Outside the window, the garden lay empty in the California moonlight, the stage where impossible things happen daily. Specialists with decades of training and millions in equipment had examined his daughter and offered nothing but carefully managed expectations. A homeless boy with bare feet and torn clothes had walked into his garden and brought her back to life. The respect George felt was grudging at first, born of pure results. But now it was deepening into something more complicated. Gratitude mixed with confusion, admiration tangled with questions he didn't know how to ask. About worth, about value, about what actually mattered when everything else was stripped away. He raised the glass to his lips finally, tasting the burn, and whispered to his reflection, "Who is teaching whom?" On Saturday afternoon, George found Melvin sitting on the garden bench after his performance, catching his breath while Lila napped in the shade. For the first time, George didn't watch from a distance. He sat down beside the boy. "Tell me about yourself," George said. Not a command, an invitation. Melvin looked startled. In 3 weeks, they had exchanged practical words, greetings, permissions, thank yous, but never this. Never a question that suggested George actually wanted to know. "There's not much to tell, sir," Melvin began, then stopped, seeing George's patient expression. He tried again. "My mother died when I was little. I don't remember much about her. Just warmth, I think. A voice singing. My father, I never knew him. Maybe he left before, maybe after. The streets of LA have been home since I was 5. Different kids, different corners. You learn quick or you don't survive. And the dancing?" Melvin's face softened. "When your stomach is empty, everything feels heavy. Your body, your thoughts, even breathing. If you sit still, the hunger wins. It's all you can think about. But if you move, if you dance, you feel light, even if just for a moment. You remember you're alive, not just surviving." George felt something crack inside his chest. He'd spent his adult life believing that control and capital were the twin pillars of power. This boy had neither, yet possessed something George had lost without noticing. The ability to create joy from nothing. A memory surfaced, unbidden. George, at 12, in a trailer park in Riverside, wearing his father's too large shirt to school because it was the only clean one. His mother working double shifts at the diner. The shame he'd felt when classmates mocked his worn sneakers. He'd climbed out of that poverty through ruthless determination, built his empire, and then, what? Locked the door behind him, pretended those years had never existed, adopted the manners and prejudices of the class he'd joined. "I've forgotten where I came from," he whispered, more to himself than Melvin. The reckoning came in waves after that. His business partners started noticing, asking careful questions during conference calls. Finally, Marcus Chen, his oldest associate, flew in from San Francisco to confront him in person. "George, there's a street kid in your home. People are talking. Think of your reputation." Marcus paced the study, agitated. "What if he steals? What if he's dangerous? What message does this send to your investors? You're bored." Before George could respond, Lila's voice cut through from the doorway. She'd wheeled herself there, eyes blazing with fierce protectiveness. "He makes me strong." "If you don't like him, you don't like me." Marcus left shortly after, shaking his head. George stood at the window, watching his daughter return to the garden where Melvin waited. The question crystallized with brutal clarity. Protect his image or protect what was actually healing his daughter? That night, sleep refused to come. George walked the mansion halls, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Every room held evidence of his success. Imported Italian marble, original Rothkos, and Pollocks on the walls. furniture that cost more than most Americans earned in a year. He'd built all this to prove he'd transcended his origins. But what had it cost him? His wife was gone. His daughter had been disappearing until a homeless boy reminded her how to laugh. "I've spent millions on reputation," George said to the portrait of his late wife hanging in the corridor. "But reputation hasn't saved her. This boy has." Dawn found him in the garden, waiting. When Melvin arrived at 4 o'clock, uncertain as always, George met him at the gate. "You are not invisible anymore," George said firmly, his hand on Melvin's thin shoulder. "You matter here. You matter to my daughter. You matter to me." Melvin's eyes widened, something like hope flickering across his face. George realized then that he'd had it backwards all along. He wasn't helping Melvin. Melvin was teaching him what wealth actually meant, what mattered when everything else was stripped away. The student had become the master, and George was finally humble enough to learn. The afternoon arrived warm and golden, the kind where time seemed to move slower. An old jazz standard drifted from a speaker in the kitchen, its rhythm lazy and sweet. Melvin was midway through his slow-motion routine, moving as though caught in honey, each gesture stretched, exaggerated, his face frozen in theatrical concentration. Lila's laughter bubbled up between breaths, her hands ready to clap. Then she said, "Wait." Melvin froze mid-movement, one leg extended, arms out. "What?" "I want to try something." Her voice carried a weight that made both Melvin and George, who'd been reading nearby, look up sharply. "Lila," George began. "I'm going to stand," she announced, her small jaw set with determination. George's book fell from his hands. Every muscle in his body tensed, torn between hope and the terror of watching her fail, of seeing that light in her eyes dim again. "Sweetheart, you don't have to." "I want to." She placed both hands firmly on the wheelchair's armrests, her knuckles already white with pressure. The first attempt yielded nothing. Her arms trembled with effort, her face scrunching, but her body remained seated. She exhaled sharply, frustrated. "It's okay," Melvin said softly, but she was already repositioning her hands. Second attempt, her shoulders rose an inch, maybe 2. Her chest lifted slightly before she fell back, panting. Melvin dropped to his knees beside the wheelchair, his face level with hers. "You can do this. I know you can." George moved closer, his legs carrying him forward, though he couldn't remember deciding to move. His breath caught in his throat. Lila closed her eyes for a moment, gathering something from deep inside. Then her eyes opened, clear, focused, fierce. She gripped the armrests again and pushed. This time, everything changed. Her shoulders rose, her chest followed. Then, impossibly, her hips began to lift. Inch by agonizing inch, her body ascended. Her legs shook violently, threatening to give out, but she held on. 1, Melvin counted, his voice thick with emotion. 2, George added, barely able to force the word out past the tightness in his throat. Lila's whole body trembled like a leaf in a storm, but she was upright now, her feet pressing against the ground, her legs bearing her weight for the first time in months. 3, she whispered, the word squeezed out through clenched teeth. Time suspended itself. 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. The garden held its breath. The music played on, oblivious. Somewhere distant, a bird called. But in that circle, Lila standing, Melvin kneeling, George frozen, the world had shrunk to just this moment, this impossible, miraculous moment. Then Lila's strength gave out. She sank back into the wheelchair, but instead of tears of defeat, laughter erupted from her chest. "I did it! Did you see? I stood. I actually stood!" Melvin exploded upward, spinning, shouting, his joy uncontainable. "You did it! You stood! Champion! Champion!" George dropped to his knees, his hands shaking as he reached for his daughter's face, tears streaming freely down his cheeks. I saw everything. I'm so proud, so incredibly proud of you." Lila reached out with both hands, one for her father, one for Melvin, pulling them both close. "I'm not scared anymore," she said, her voice clear and strong. "When he dances, I feel like I can do anything." At the gate, security guards stood with hands over their mouths. Through the kitchen window, staff members wiped their eyes. The household had witnessed it. The moment everything shifted from impossible to possible. That night, long after Lila had fallen asleep exhausted and triumphant, George walked the garden alone. He stood where she'd stood, where the miracle had happened, and looked up at the California stars. "Thank you," he whispered into the darkness. "Thank you for sending this boy." The garden, alive with night sounds and possibility, seemed to whisper back, "This is just the beginning." 3 days after Lila stood, George found Melvin sitting alone on the back steps as dust settled over the estate. The boy's shoulders were hunched, his gaze fixed on the ground, looking somehow smaller than usual. "You shouldn't be out here alone anymore," George said quietly, lowering himself onto the step beside him. Melvin glanced up, uncertain. "I was just thinking, sir, about everything." George took a breath, the words he'd rehearsed suddenly feeling inadequate. "This is your home now, permanently, not as a visitor, not as someone who leaves at 6 o'clock, as family." "Sir," Melvin's voice cracked on the single word, "you gave my daughter hope when I couldn't. When all my money and power and connections failed, you succeeded with nothing but joy and a generous heart. You showed me what real wealth looks like." George turned to face the boy fully. "Anyone who can give hope deserves love. You're family now, Melvin, if you'll have us." For the first time since George had known him, Melvin's composure broke completely. Tears spilled down his cheeks, his thin shoulders shaking. No one's ever... "I know," George said softly, pulling the boy into an embrace. "But you're wanted now. You're home." The changes came swiftly. A bedroom was prepared, not a guest room, but Melvin's room, with his name on a small plaque beside the door. The kitchen staff were instructed to prepare 3 full meals daily. George took Melvin to Rodeo Drive for clothes, watching the boys wonder at choosing shirts that actually fit. School enrollment papers were filed at the exclusive private academy in Beverly Hills for the fall term. But the outside world noticed, and it had opinions. The Los Angeles Times ran a feature. TMZ posted photos. Social media erupted. Some praising George's compassion, others questioning his judgment, his sanity, his fitness as a parent and businessman. Billionaire folly trended alongside humanity restored. His business partners requested an emergency meeting. They arrived in a delegation, faces grave, gathering in his Century City office. "George, this will damage your standing in the community," Marcus said, the others nodding. "The optics are terrible. The board is concerned. Investors are asking questions about your decision-making abilities." George stood at the head of the conference table, his voice calm but unyielding. "My daughter is standing again. My daughter is laughing again. My daughter has hope again. That is the only standing I care about. But the business implications are secondary to my daughter's life." George's tone left no room for argument. "This conversation is over." At dinner that night, Melvin sat nervously at the formal table, eyeing the array of silverware with obvious confusion. Lila leaned over, whispering which fork to use, both of them dissolving into giggles when Melvin accidentally used the salad fork for his main course. George watched them, his heart fuller than it had been in years, and realized this laughter, this connection, was worth more than any business deal. "Melvin is my brother now," Lila announced suddenly, her voice clear and certain. "Anyone who hurts him hurts me." The whispers followed George everywhere. The iron hand softened into "the man with heart," sometimes said with admiration, sometimes with derision. 2 major contracts fell through, investors citing concerns about judgment and focus. George signed the termination papers without hesitation. But new opportunities emerged from people who valued character over calculation, who saw strength in vulnerability. A tech entrepreneur from Silicon Valley reached out, impressed by George's priorities. A philanthropist from New York wanted to discuss partnerships. The losses were real, but they felt insignificant compared to what he'd gained. Late one evening, George found Melvin standing in his new bedroom doorway, looking lost. "I don't deserve this," Melvin whispered. "All this. I'm just a street kid who danced." George placed a hand on his shoulder. "Deserve has nothing to do with it. Love isn't something you earn like wages or win like a prize. Love is given freely, or it's not love at all. You gave it to my daughter when you had every reason not to. Now, let us give it back." Melvin nodded slowly, and for the first time, stepped fully into his room, into his home, and closed the door not as a guest, but as someone who belonged. 6 months had rewritten everything. "Melvin, we're going to be late." Lila's voice rang through the upstairs hallway, bright and insistent. The sound of 2 sets of feet, one running, one moving more carefully, echoed down the stairs as both children rushed toward breakfast, backpacks bouncing. At the table, the morning unfolded with the beautiful chaos of ordinary family life. Melvin reached for the last piece of toast. Lila swatted his hand away. "That's mine. You already had 2. Their bickering dissolved into laughter when George intervened, cutting the toast in half with mock solemnity. "Justice has been served." Lila walked now, with assistance. Some days she used her wheelchair. But the fear that had paralyzed her more than the accident ever did, that fear was gone. Twice a week, Melvin accompanied her to physical therapy at Cedars-Sinai, cheering from the sidelines when she managed 3 steps unassisted, celebrating small victories like they were Olympic gold medals. School had been an adjustment. The private academy in Beverly Hills was a world away from street corners. Other parents initially kept their distance, whispering behind hands, watching Melvin with suspicious eyes. But children see clearly what adults often miss. Within weeks, Melvin's kindness and quick humor had won over his classmates, and their acceptance gradually shifted their parents' perspectives. At the last parent meeting, George had introduced himself and added, "This is my son, Melvin," with such natural pride that no one dared question it. The mansion that once echoed with silence now pulsed with life. Music played in the kitchen, everything from jazz to hip-hop to Lila's current pop obsessions. Friends came over after school. Laughter bounced off marble floors that had forgotten what joy sounded like. George walked through rooms that felt inhabited again, alive again, and marveled at the transformation. His business had changed too. He consulted his team more, listened longer before deciding, led with compassion rather than intimidation. The surprising result? Company culture improved, employee loyalty deepened, and profitability actually grew. In his office one afternoon, staring at quarterly reports that exceeded projections, George whispered, "I thought being hard made me strong. Being open made me stronger." Melvin thrived in ways that went beyond survival. He excelled in math, discovered a love for American history, made genuine friends. But he still danced, not for coins or from desperation, but purely for joy. On weekends, the garden became their stage again. This Saturday afternoon, Melvin performed while Lila attempted moves from her wheelchair, spinning in small circles, arms outstretched. George, coaxed into joining, moved with the stiff awkwardness of someone deeply out of practice, his attempted moonwalk so terrible that all 3 collapsed in hysterical laughter. As evening approached, they sat together on the mansion steps, watching the sun paint the Los Angeles sky in shades of amber and rose. Lila positioned herself between George and Melvin, holding both their hands. A small bridge connecting 2 people who'd found each other through her. George spoke quietly, his voice carrying the weight of revelation. "I built an empire, owned properties on 3 continents, commanded respect everywhere I went, but I had nothing, absolutely nothing, until the day this boy danced into our lives and taught me what wealth actually means." Melvin looked up at him. "What does it mean?" "It means having people who matter. It means giving hope without expecting anything in return. It means love that doesn't count the cost, that doesn't measure worth by bank statements or social standing." Lila squeezed both their hands. "It means family." The 3 of them sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped lower. The mansion behind them, no longer a mausoleum of grief, but a home filled with light, laughter, and the messy beauty of real love. Not perfect. They still had hard days, setbacks, moments of struggle, but genuinely, undeniably better. All 3 transformed by each other in ways none of them could have predicted. Sometimes the answer to our deepest need comes from the most unexpected place. Sometimes strength looks like vulnerability. Sometimes wealth is measured not in what we own, but in who we love. And sometimes the greatest power on earth is simply being brave enough to open your heart. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Subscribe for more stories that remind us what truly matters. Comment below where you're watching from, and share a time when an unexpected person changed your life.